It was the second Tuesday of November, a day wrapped in one of those sullen London fogs that seemed to turn the very gaslight to butter. The sky hung low and ochre, smothering the city's ceaseless clatter beneath a heavy woolen silence. I, Dr. John Watson, had just returned from my morning rounds in Wimpole Street when I found Holmes leaning against the hearth of our Baker Street lodgings, fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes narrowed at the fire. Without lifting his gaze, he spoke. "You will find a note addressed to me upon the mantel. Read it aloud, if you would be so good." The note was on thick, rough-edged stationery. I obliged. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I beg you to attend to a matter of urgency. A most disturbing incident has occurred at the Chelsea Day School for Girls, of which I am head mistress. This morning, the caretaker discovered a handprint, bloody and unmistakable, on the main schoolhouse door. No one within the building is injured, and yet the mark remains. Please come swiftly. I fear this may be more than a cruel prank. Yours, in apprehension, Miss Helen Trenchard." When I looked up, Holmes was already reaching for his overcoat. "Watson," he said, "put on your thickest scarf. I suspect this day shall be chillier than even November intends." The Chelsea Day School for Girls was nestled between a silent church and a shuttered grocer's, its ivy-laced brick facade barely visible through the veil of fog. As we stepped from the cab, the sound of our boots against cobbles seemed the only sign that life stirred in this corner of the city. A trim woman in a navy wool dress awaited us under the wrought-iron archway, her gloved hands clenched tight around a ring of keys. "Miss Trenchard?" Holmes asked, bowing slightly. "You came," she said, voice taut. "Thank you. It's rather worse than I described. Please, this way." We followed her to the school's entrance, a stout oaken door with brass fittings and a high, arched frame, and there it was, just above the handle, a broad smeared handprint in drying blood. 4 fingers, splayed wide, no accompanying streaks, no sign of injury or struggle, just a solitary, chilling impression, like an accusation left mid-gesture. Holmes bent close, drawing a magnifying lens from his coat. Dried partially, yet still tacky at the edges. I estimate the mark was made sometime between 4 and 6 this morning, before sunrise certainly. Miss Trenchard, who discovered it? The caretaker, Mr. Pruitt. He unlocks the gate at 6:30. It was he who alerted me. And who else has entered or left the premises since then? No one, she said firmly. I ordered the building sealed. The girls and staff were dismissed before they arrived. Only Mr. Pruitt, myself, and the constable who took my statement have seen it. Holmes turned to me. "Watson, would you agree this is human blood?" I bent to examine the mark, noting the slight discoloration and congealed consistency. "It's blood, yes. Human, likely, though I cannot be sure without further analysis." Holmes nodded, then paced a slow circle around the threshold, boots crunching gravel. "No sign of forced entry. The lock remains unbroken. The mark was made from outside, not in. Curious?" Inside the school, we were led through hushed corridors, lined with student portraits, pastel watercolors, and blackboards freshly wiped clean. Everything smelled of chalk and lavender polish. Miss Trenchard paused before a large, double-doored classroom. "This is room 11. If you'll allow me, there was one other thing I found peculiar." She opened the door. At first glance, the room was as ordinary as any schoolroom, desks aligned, slates stacked neatly, but Holmes's eyes fixed on the window-sill. A small object lay there. He picked it up delicately. "A hair ribbon," he murmured, holding it to the light. "Red silk, hand-stitched with the initials GM, and faintly damp. Miss Trenchard?" "Yes." "Do you have a pupil whose name matches these initials?" Her face tightened. "Gwendolen Marsh, 10 years old, but she has not been in school for 2 days. Her father sent word she'd fallen ill. Nothing serious, I was told. Holmes turned abruptly, eyes alight. And yet her ribbon is here, and damp, and sitting in a classroom no one has used since Monday. Miss Trenchard's hand flew to her mouth. I don't understand. Nor do I, said Holmes, but I intend to. Tell me, where does the Marsh family reside? On Marlborough Crescent. A short walk, perhaps 10 minutes. Mr. Marsh is a solicitor. Holmes was already striding back to the entryway. Watson, with me. Miss Trenchard, remain within the building and admit no one else. It is imperative that nothing be disturbed. As we stepped out into the dense fog once more, Holmes spoke, low and brisk. Observe the chain, Watson, a bloody handprint, no forced entry, a missing girl's ribbon found damp and placed neatly. The implication is not random violence, it is communication. Someone is trying to say something, and they chose the schoolhouse door as their canvas. We walked in silence for a moment, our coats trailing vapour behind us like ghosts. And what do you suspect the message to be? I asked. That, Holmes replied, depends on what we find at the Marsh household. But if I'm not mistaken, he paused, turning sharply into a side lane. Well, we are already too late. Our boots struck the pavement of Marlborough Crescent with a solemn rhythm, the fog curling around us like the silent breath of the city itself. Rows of terrace homes emerged and dissolved into the mist, their iron gates and frosted windows indistinct, as though London itself wished to withhold its secrets a little longer. Holmes moved with purpose, his long strides almost noiseless despite the damp. I followed close behind, my mind circling the strange elements we'd encountered at the school. A bloodied handprint with no source. A ribbon belonging to a girl who had not been present. A locked door bearing a message, but from whom? We halted before a tidy brownstone, its brass numbers dulled by age, but still legible. 17 Marlborough Crescent. The curtains in the upper window were drawn, though a faint flicker of light pulsed behind the lower panes. Holmes pressed the bell. It was answered, not by a maid, but by a man. He was in his late 40s, with grey at the temples, a lawyer's clipped moustache, and the sort of habitual tension about the jaw that bespoke years of exactitude. "Yes?" he asked stiffly. "Mr. Edward Marsh?" Holmes inquired. "I am, and you are?" "My name is Sherlock Holmes. This is my associate, Dr. John Watson. We come regarding your daughter, Gwendolen." His brow furrowed. "She is recovering from a cold, nothing more. I sent word to Miss Trenchard 2 days ago." "Indeed," Holmes replied. "Yet her hair ribbon was found this morning upon a classroom window-sill. It was damp, and a bloody handprint was left on the school's front door." Marsh paled. For a moment, his composure faltered as though something unspoken had been touched, but he recovered swiftly. I don't understand. Gwen hasn't left the house." "May we see her?" I asked gently. He hesitated. "She's resting. I'd rather not disturb her." Holmes' gaze sharpened. "It would ease a great many concerns if we could lay eyes on her, sir. I assure you no disturbance need occur." Reluctantly, Marsh stepped aside. The interior of the home was silent and pristine. A maid bustled nervously in the hallway, her eyes flitting between us. Marsh led us upstairs, the carpeted steps absorbing our footfalls, and paused outside a door. "She's likely asleep," he said. He knocked softly, then entered. The room was girlish and proper, lace curtains, porcelain dolls, a small bookshelf with gilt-edged volumes. But the bed was neatly made, the windows slightly ajar, and no child within. Holmes stepped forward. His eyes scanned the room once, twice. "There is no sign of sleep here," he said quietly. "No impression in the pillow, no rumpled blankets, no damp handkerchiefs or medicine bottles." Marsh turned visibly pale. "She was here this morning," he said, too quickly. My wife is away. I left for chambers early, but I instructed Mrs. Darnley, our housekeeper, to keep her in bed." Holmes opened the closet door. Empty. Then crossed to the writing desk. "Watson," he called softly. I joined him. Upon the desk, barely concealed beneath a child's diary, was a small envelope, its flap unsealed. Inside was a single folded page. Holmes unfolded it, then handed it to me without a word. It was written in a child's hand. "Please don't tell Father. I had to go. I heard her calling. She said it was my turn to help. I took the back stairs. I'll come back after supper. Love, Gwen." Holmes turned to Marsh, whose complexion had grown ashen. "Mr. Marsh, did your daughter ever mention someone named her? Perhaps an imaginary friend? Or someone she believed was communicating with her?" Marsh nodded slowly. She spoke of a woman who watched her through the fence at playtime. Said she wore gloves and never blinked. But we thought it fancy. She's a dreamy girl, always reading ghost stories. Holmes's face darkened. "There are no dreams in this," he said coldly. "Only cunning, and a child lured from her home under the cloak of morning fog." Back downstairs, Holmes requested to examine the garden behind the house. Marsh led us through a back parlour to a wrought-iron gate opening onto a narrow strip of yard. Dead leaves had gathered in drifts. Beyond the hedges, a rear alley ran the length of the block. Holmes knelt to examine the mud near the garden wall. "Ah," he muttered, "small prints booted, leading to the rear gate, and this—" He lifted a broken twig, freshly snapped. "She left by this route, almost certainly, but she did not come alone. Look here, Watson." A second set of footprints, larger and deeper, trailed beside the small ones. The stride was longer, the heels digging in with weight. She was met, perhaps watched the night before, or beckoned at dawn. Either way, the second person was waiting. Holmes stood. "Watson, do you recall the ribbon?" "Yes, it was damp." "And the fog was heavy only this morning, but her note suggests she left before breakfast. The ribbon would not still be damp unless it had been returned." "You mean—" "I mean someone brought it back, deliberately, left it on the windowsill as a signal, and I suspect the handprint followed shortly after." "A signal to whom?" "To me," Holmes said darkly. "Or to someone like me. An invitation or a challenge. Either way, it reeks of theatre." We returned inside to find the housekeeper, Mrs. Darnley, awaiting us with trembling hands. I didn't know, sir," she stammered to Marsh. "I swear she was in her bed at dawn. I brought her warm milk and I saw her curled up under the blanket." Holmes turned sharply. "At what hour?" "6, sir, but I always bring it then." Holmes paused. "And when you returned later?" "I didn't. The master said she was to rest. I assumed she was still sleeping." Holmes nodded once. She had already gone. He turned to Marsh. "Sir, I suggest you send word to the yard. Tell them a child is missing and likely in danger. I will do what I can." "And where will you begin?" I asked him, as we stepped back into the mist-shrouded street. Holmes's face was grave, almost solemn. "By finding the person who left that handprint, and determining whether it was meant to terrify or to confess." The fog had thinned by late morning, yet it lingered stubbornly in alley crevices and along roof lines like a sullen guest overstaying its welcome. Holmes and I made our way back toward Chelsea in silence, threading through quieter lanes, where even the clatter of hooves was subdued. I recognized the storm gathering behind Holmes's eyes and knew better than to interrupt it. He had entered that curious mental state where thought moved ahead of language, the outer world held at bay until he saw fit to let it return. When he finally spoke, it was as we turned onto Lockwell Street, his voice taut and precise. Igutsan, consider the components. A child missing, yet no ransom demand. A bloodied handprint, yet no body. No trace of violence within the school or the home. A ribbon deliberately returned. The sequence is intentional, symbolic. Symbolic of what? He didn't answer at once. Instead, he gestured toward a small tobacconist's shop tucked beneath a sloped cornice. Wait here. Holmes stepped inside and emerged moments later with a folded news sheet under his arm. As we resumed walking, he scanned the columns with the intensity of a man expecting to find something buried there, not by misprint, but by design. He tapped the margin with his finger. Aha. What is it? Buried beneath the shipping prices and advertisements for hair tonic, he said, handing it to me, is a notice from last week. Candlelight vigil to be held in memory of Eloise Bracknell, aged 10, tragically lost 1 year ago this Sunday. Parents, faculty and schoolmates of the Chelsea Day School invited, 7 p.m. at St. Jude's Chapel. I looked up slowly. You think it's connected? I think it is no coincidence that Gwen Marsh vanished in the same fog that took another child a year before, and that someone left a message on the same schoolhouse door precisely 5 days before the anniversary. He stopped at the iron gate of the Chelsea Day School, now reopened, with the bloodied handprint cleaned away by order of the constable. But Holmes, I said, the Bracknell child, what was the cause of death? Holmes turned to me with eyes like flint. She was found at the base of the Millstrand embankment, bruised, half submerged, officially ruled an accident. Child wandered too close to the ledge during a game of hide-and-seek, but, I prompted, Eloise Bracknell, like Gwendolen Marsh, had reportedly spoken of a woman in gloves who watched her through the school fence. Inside the headmistress's office, Miss Trenchard stood beside the hearth, visibly unsettled, but still composed. Holmes wasted no time. Miss Trenchard, do you recall a pupil named Eloise Bracknell? She nodded slowly. Yes, a quiet, thoughtful child, always writing poems. Her death nearly shattered the school, but I thought— You thought it was an accident, Holmes finished. Tell me, did she ever report being followed or approached? Miss Trenchard hesitated. She once told a teacher, Miss Hearn, that someone had left her daisies in her coat pocket. She claimed it was from a lady with long black gloves who smiled but never spoke. We assumed it was fantasy. Did she describe this woman's face? No, only the gloves, and that she stood very still. It gave the staff a chill, if I'm honest. Holmes turned to the window, his gaze distant. And where is Miss Hearn now? She left the school 3 months ago, married a clergyman in Yorkshire, I believe. She may still write to Miss Gracie, the secretary. Holmes inclined his head. Please ask Miss Gracie to supply us with the address. As Miss Trenchard departed to do so, Holmes moved to the filing cabinet and knelt beside it, opening a heavy drawer marked Incident Reports. Watson, he said, lend your eyes. I want records of any unusual reports from last autumn to the present, strange sightings, missing items, staff complaints, even those dismissed as trifling. We pored over yellowing ledgers, flipping through pages of scrawled entries. For 10 minutes, nothing leapt out. Then I found it. Here, I said, pointing, an entry from February. Caretaker reports ash on windowsill of room 11 arranged in strange pattern. Possible prank. No damage found. No follow-up requested. Holmes's eyes lit up. Room 11 again. And ash, I murmured. Why would anyone place ash on a windowsill? Holmes smiled faintly. Because ashes speak to fire, Watson, and fire, like blood, has long been used as a symbol, a ritualistic mark, perhaps even a warning. He rose abruptly. Come, there's one more person we must speak to today. Mr. Pruitt. We found the caretaker, Mr. Edmund Pruitt, unwinding a garden hose near the rear courtyard. He was a heavy-set man with silver bristles and an uneven gait. Holmes approached him with uncharacteristic politeness. "Mr. Pruitt, may we trouble you for a few moments more?" He looked up, wary. "Still poking at that blasted handprint, are you? I told the constable I didn't touch it. Found it just before 6. "We believe you," Holmes replied, "but we're more interested in a different matter. The ash on the windowsill last winter. Room 11? Pruitt blinked. "Lord, I'd near forgot that." Gave me a right turn, it did. Looked like someone had traced a star or wheel or something in soot. I wiped it off with vinegar. Do you remember which day it was? Pruitt scratched his chin. "Mid-February, I reckon. Cold as iron. Day after the new moon, now I think on it." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Have you noticed anyone lingering near the back fence in recent weeks? A woman in gloves, perhaps?" The man paused, his brow furrowing. "There is a woman," he said slowly. "Been seeing her just past dusk most nights for a week. Stands near the alley gate, doesn't move, wears a dark hat and scarf, never speaks." "Which direction does she come from?" "She walks in from the canal road, same way each time." Holmes turned to me, his face unreadable. "Watson, we have a direction. We follow it. Tonight." The afternoon darkened early, as November afternoons in London are wont to do. By 4:30, the sky had already turned to slate, and the street lamps began their nightly vigil. Holmes, seated in the corner of our Baker Street sitting room, was an unmoving silhouette against the fire's glow, his eyes closed, fingertips pressed together in a steeple of thought. "Holmes," I said at length, glancing up from the notes I had scribbled in the margin of my journal, "do you truly believe the woman Mr. Pruitt saw is real, and not some trick of fog and suspicion? These sightings always seem to take on lives of their own." His eyes snapped open. "When the same description recurs across 3 sources, Miss Trenchard, Edward Marsh, and now Pruitt, I incline towards substance over fancy. Besides," he added, rising to his feet and donning his greatcoat, "only something real leaves footprints." He retrieved a small black box from the mantel and slipped it into his pocket. "What is that?" I asked. "A magnesium flare. In case the alley proves inhospitable to subtle observation. Come, Watson, our dusk sentinel awaits." The canal road lay a quarter-mile behind the schoolhouse, where the modern sprawl of Chelsea yielded to that older, neglected edge of the city, storage sheds, abandoned warehouses, and rusted barge landings. The Thames, swollen and muddy, whispered alongside us with a voice like a warning, muttered under breath. Holmes had chosen our position with care, an alcove between 2 crumbling brick storehouses, just opposite the iron gate at the rear of the school grounds. A slanted view of the alley allowed us to see without being seen. We arrived at 5 minutes to 6. Holmes consulted his watch. "Pruitt claimed she appears just after dusk. That would be now." We waited. Fog crawled like a slow creature from the river, drifting low and clinging to the boots. The gaslight at the corner buzzed faintly. A stray cat padded across the cobbles and vanished under a stack of crates. Still no woman. Then a faint, deliberate sound, click, click, click. A rhythmic tapping on the paving stones. Holmes stiffened beside me. "There," he whispered. Emerging from the river end of the alley came a figure, tall, slim, and dressed in a long, dark coat. A brimmed hat concealed the upper face, and hands were gloved, just as described. The figure moved slowly, precisely, as though not merely walking, but marking a path. She reached the iron gate behind the schoolhouse and stopped. She did not try the handle, nor glance behind. She simply stood, head slightly tilted, one gloved hand resting on the gate's top rail. I held my breath. Holmes remained motionless. 2 minutes passed. Then she reached into her coat pocket and withdrew something, a small envelope, white against the black of her glove. She slipped it through the iron bars where it fluttered to the ground on the school side. Without a backward glance, she turned and walked away, vanishing down the opposite end of the lane. Holmes stepped forward, but not to pursue. He waited. "She expected to be seen," he murmured. "She wanted to be watched." "You believe she saw us?" "I believe she calculated where a detective would be. It is not the same thing, but it is more dangerous." We retrieved the envelope at once. Inside was a single sheet of parchment, written in a neat, looping script. 2 children, 2 flames, 1 lost to the river, 1 to the mirror. She comes when they forget. I help them remember. The lock is not the door. Look where the sun does not rise. I read it twice aloud. Holmes did not respond at first. He took the note, held it to the lamplight, then sniffed its edge. Lavender water, strong, masking something sharper, charcoal or ink thinner perhaps, and the paper, hand-cut. He tapped it lightly. Custom parchment, not sold in common stationers. And the message? Riddles, but purposeful. The mirror may be metaphorical, but more likely refers to an object. The lock is not the door, a philosophical misdirection, and where the sun does not rise, Watson, what direction does our schoolhouse door face? North, I believe. Indeed. And what part of the building never sees sunlight, I thought. The old cellar? It's buried beneath the north wing. Miss Trenchard mentioned it once. No longer in use since the renovations. Holmes's eyes flashed. Then we go tonight. It was nearly midnight when we returned to the schoolhouse. Miss Trenchard had given us her blessing, if not without visible anxiety. Mr. Pruitt, loyal but bemused, let us in through the caretaker's entrance, and we descended into the belly of the school. The cellar was as Holmes had predicted, cold, stone-lined, and unused. Shelves once filled with coal and kindling now held only dust and cobwebs. The air was heavy with the scent of mould and old varnish. Holmes lit the magnesium flare with a hiss and raised it high, bathing the chamber in a stark white light. "There," he said. At the far end of the cellar was a rusted locker, its door ajar. We approached slowly. Holmes opened the locker wider. Inside was a child's overcoat. Beneath it a pair of shoes, a small brass key, and a leather-bound diary. Holmes lifted the diary carefully. On the first page, in delicate handwriting, was the name Eloise Bracknell. "Watson," Holmes murmured, "this diary may yet tell us what the official record would not." He flipped to the final pages. The last entry read, "She watches from the glass again. She wants to trade. I said no. She said Gwen would say yes. I told Miss Hearn, but she didn't believe me. I will hide the key. If I go, maybe it ends." Holmes stared at the page, then at the locker. "The key," he said. "What lock was it meant for? And who did she mean by she watches from the glass?" The wind moaned through the cellar grates. Suddenly Holmes turned sharply to me. "She said Gwen would say yes." "Yes," I echoed, the weight of it settling. Then Gwen was meant to be next. Holmes extinguished the flare. "Then we are running out of time." Holmes and I emerged from the cellar into the narrow corridor of the schoolhouse's rear wing just after 1 o'clock in the morning, the damp, stone chill still clinging to our clothes. Holmes carried the diary wrapped in his handkerchief, its final pages turning slowly in his mind like the tumblers of a lock. The brass key we had found was tucked securely in his coat pocket. He paused at the base of the stairwell, the pale gaslight overhead casting a long shadow across the floorboards. "Watson," he said, "what do you make of the phrase, 'She watches from the glass again'?" I considered. "A mirror, surely. A child's imagination seeing things where there are none." He looked at me sideways. "Yes, a mirror, but not simply a child's reflection. Eloise meant something particular, something seen and returned. Holmes turned and led the way up the stairs. Back in Miss Trenchard's office, Holmes laid the diary gently on the blotter and began copying several pages into his notebook with swift precision. Outside the frosted window, the fog had thickened once again, hiding the moon and swathing the schoolyard in dreamlike obscurity. I stood by the hearth, the remains of the cellar's dampness warming from my coat, when Holmes's voice broke the silence. The language in Eloise's diary is careful, measured. She doesn't speak like a fanciful child, she documents. She was frightened, I offered. No, he replied. She was methodical, which means she believed what she saw and wrote, and she wanted someone, anyone, to understand. He held up a copied page. Listen. The mirror in room 11 flickered again. Not my face, another girl's. She smiled wrong. She doesn't blink. I remembered the stories, Miss Trenchard's description of Eloise, and the whispered remarks of Gwen Marsh about the gloved woman. A reflection that is not a reflection, I murmured. Holmes tapped the page. This is not metaphor. Room 11 has a freestanding cheval mirror, quite old if I recall. He stood abruptly. Come, we must see it. The school was eerily silent as we moved through the halls. A single lamp flickered faintly at the end of the corridor, casting our shadows long across the wooden floor. Holmes unlocked room 11 with a key Miss Trenchard had entrusted to him. The room had been tidied for the next day's lessons, chalkboards wiped, desks aligned, and there, against the far wall, stood the mirror. It was large and oval, framed in black walnut, its surface slightly clouded with age. Holmes approached slowly, his footsteps nearly soundless. I followed, a sudden chill prickling across my neck, though there was no draught. He stared at the glass, then looked behind it. No marks, no mechanism, and yet he turned back to the reflection. The room's interior was shown perfectly. Chalk tray, desk rows, our own forms faintly distorted by the warped glass, but nothing unusual. Holmes pulled the brass key from his coat pocket and held it up. If Eloise hid the key with the mirror in mind, then perhaps... He moved to the base of the mirror's frame, inspecting the wood along the lower edge. After several moments, he pressed against a small, circular knot in the grain. There was a faint click. A hidden panel slid open at the bottom. Inside was a narrow, velvet-lined recess and an object. Holmes withdrew it carefully, a small porcelain doll's head, painted delicately with rosy cheeks and eyes that, though glassy, seemed wide and unblinking. He turned it over. Etched into the neck, in childlike script, was a single name. Gwen. My breath caught. But how? Holmes frowned, examining the head more closely. The name was etched recently. The porcelain is clean, unscratched. This was planted. Planted? Yes. Someone accessed this compartment again long after Eloise. But who would even know of it? He held the head in one hand, the key in the other. Someone who read the diary, or someone who watched her hide it. He stood suddenly and turned to the chalkboard. With the edge of his glove, he wiped across it. A faint smear revealed something beneath, writing, partially erased. Holmes used his sleeve to rub further. There, written in faint blue chalk, was a child's scrawl. If you find her, don't look in her eyes. She learns your name. The room fell utterly silent. I stepped back from the mirror, my throat dry. This is madness, Holmes. Children's games, scare stories. But Holmes's face was grim. Children speak truths adults are trained to ignore. Gwen saw something, or someone. So did Eloise. And they were taught to fear it. He looked at the porcelain head again. "She learns your name," he repeated quietly. "Watson, we are not dealing with an ordinary abduction. This is a message. Someone is recreating the steps of Eloise's disappearance, item by item, clue by clue, but not for ransom, not even for revenge." "Then why?" "To make us see." We returned to Miss Trenchard's office and carefully placed the key, the doll head, and the diary into a satchel. Holmes sat down again and began listing out the sequence. "Let's arrange the facts. 1. Gwen vanished early morning, likely between 5 and 6. 2. Her ribbon was left on the windowsill, deliberately. 3. A bloodied handprint appeared with no victim and no corresponding blood source. 4. A woman in gloves appears in the alley, places a riddle. 5. That riddle leads us to a hidden key and a porcelain doll marked Gwen." He tapped the table. "Eloise mentioned a trade, a bargain, a voice behind the glass. What if whoever orchestrated this believes that children can be exchanged, that one can be lost and another taken in her place?" My stomach turned. "You're suggesting a pattern, that Gwen's abduction isn't isolated." "Not only that," Holmes said. "I believe it's part of a ritual, a psychological ritual to be precise, carefully staged, a recreation meant to mimic supernatural terror but constructed entirely by human design." "Someone is playing a ghost," I said, realization dawning. "Yes," Holmes whispered. "But behind that mask there is still flesh and blood." There was a knock on the office door. It opened to reveal Miss Trenchard, her dressing gown thrown hastily over a nightgown, her eyes wide. "Mr. Holmes," she said breathlessly, "you must come at once." "What is it?" "It's the drawing room. I heard a noise. I came down, and someone's been inside." We followed her swiftly down the hall. The drawing room lay near the front entrance of the school. The door had been left ajar. Holmes entered first. The curtains fluttered in the breeze. The window had been forced open. And on the table, resting precisely in the centre of the room, was a child's music box. Its lid was closed. Holmes reached for it slowly, then paused. He listened. From inside the box, faint but unmistakable, came the soft sound of a lullaby winding down, a single note repeated again and again, as if caught, as if waiting to begin. The music box clicked once, softly, almost shyly, and the tinny lullaby ceased. The silence that followed was unnerving, as if the room itself were listening. Holmes did not open the lid at once. He crouched beside the drawing-room table and examined the box's position in relation to the floorboards, then the faint smudge on the window frame. "No fingerprints," he murmured. "Only a trace of soot on the hinge, the same shade found in room 11's ash markings. Watson, note the arrangement, centre of the table, precisely aligned with the chair legs. Whoever left it took great care." He tapped the top of the box. "Listen, it's still ticking." "Should we open it?" I asked. He didn't respond at first. Then, with a flick of his fingers, he undid the brass latch and gently raised the lid. Inside was a figurine, ivory pale, a girl with flowing curls in a school pinafore, frozen mid-spin on a mirrored base. The music was not reactivated. Instead, folded beneath the velvet lining, was a second note. Holmes removed it with his tweezers and unfolded the delicate parchment. One girl watched, one listened, one opened the door. Gwen is the one who listened. She hears me now. The bell will ring once. Holmes read it aloud. Miss Trenchard, who had remained just outside the room, pressed a hand to her lips. "What does it mean?" She whispered. Holmes straightened slowly, slipping the note into a fresh envelope. "It means the person behind this has been inside your school not once, but several times." They know the rooms, the layout, even the schedule of those who patrol it. Miss Trenchard, does your school possess a bell tower? She nodded, bewildered. Yes, above the chapel wing, but the bell hasn't rung in years. It was disconnected after the old headmistress passed. The rope was removed. Holmes held up a finger. Yet if our antagonist writes the bell will ring once, they are implying an intent, not memory. You think it's a warning? I asked. I think, Holmes said, it is an appointment. We ascended to the bell tower with haste. The stairs creaked beneath our feet. The narrow wooden passageway wound tightly into a square spiral, the air becoming colder as we climbed. At the top, we found the disused bell, a hulking bronze fixture suspended by frayed cables, its surface pocked with corrosion and bird droppings. The pull rope had indeed been severed. Only a frayed stump hung from the beam. Holmes studied the mechanism. See here, the bell has not rung in years, but it could. The hammer's arm is intact. With sufficient leverage, one could strike it manually. But why announce it? I asked. To suggest finality, Holmes replied. The ringing of a bell to mark the hour, or the end. He pulled a pencil from his coat and knelt to the floorboards. And yet, there's dust, Watson, and footprints through it. I crouched beside him. Indeed, there were faint, partial impressions. Small, delicate. A child's feet, Holmes muttered, and not recent, days old perhaps. Gwen's? Miss Trenchard paled behind us. No student is ever permitted up here. Holmes gave her a sharp glance. Then someone brought her. He reached for the satchel, withdrew Eloise's diary, and reopened the final pages. Then with a sudden movement, he turned back to the wall and examined the support beam just beneath the bell. There, in a faint graphite scrawl no larger than a thumbprint, were 3 letters. E.B. Eloise Bracknell, I said. She came here too, Holmes confirmed. Not just the cellar. She stood beneath this very bell and left her mark. She knew it was important. But why the bell? Why this place? I asked. Holmes stood slowly. Because a bell is not merely an object. It is a symbol, a herald, a harbinger, and for whoever has recreated this pattern, they wish to toll it as a sign, to mark the completion of something, the final stage. He turned to Miss Trenchard. Has anyone had access to this tower recently? No, only the caretaker has keys, and I can't imagine Mr. Pruitt bringing a child up here in secret. Holmes frowned. Unless Mr. Pruitt is not the only one with keys. We returned to the main hall, and Holmes asked Miss Trenchard to summon the full list of current staff, members. While she retrieved it, he examined the baseboards along the school's back corridors, tapping sections gently with the butt of his cane. At last, he paused before the janitor's cupboard near room 11. There, he said. I frowned. What is it? He pointed to the doorframe. Barely visible, but see the indentations. Someone has filed this lock down. A skeleton key would turn it easily. Miss Trenchard returned then with the staff list. Holmes read it in silence. Then his eyes narrowed. Miss Trenchard, I note you've recently hired a part-time assistant, Evelyn Drowse. She looked surprised. Yes, just last term. She volunteered through a church scheme, helping with art lessons. Quiet woman, polite, but odd. In what way? She seldom made eye contact, wore gloves even in spring. The children liked her well enough, though a few said she spoke to herself in corners. Holmes nodded once. When did she last appear? Now that you mention it, not for 2 weeks. I assume she'd taken ill. Do you have her application? Yes, but her references were vague. One from a Mrs. Hargreaves in Clerkenwell. Holmes turned to me. Watson, tomorrow we visit Clerkenwell, but for tonight we must remain here. Why? I asked. Holmes closed the satchel and buttoned his coat. Because we are being invited to witness the bell. And when it tolls, Gwen Marsh may be led back or lost forever. We positioned ourselves in the chapel that night, concealed behind the heavy velvet drapes that lined its apse. The bell tower loomed overhead, accessible only by the winding stair. A faint breeze stirred the hem of the altar cloths, the gaslight was dimmed, midnight passed, then one. Holmes was still, motionless, save for the occasional flick of his eyes toward the tower's upper railing, visible through a small window cut into the chapel's ceiling. Then a footstep, faint, measured. Holmes signalled for silence. I held my breath. We heard it again, this time descending from the tower stairs. Then the unmistakable clang of metal striking bronze. Dong, once, echoing through the chapel like a verdict. Holmes bolted upright, flinging the curtain aside. From the stairwell, a figure turned, small, barefoot, pale nightdress, Gwendolen Marsh, but she wasn't alone. Behind her, cloaked in shadow and descending silently, was a woman, tall, gloved and hatless. Her face was hidden by the dark. Holmes stepped into the aisle. "Stop right there," he said. The woman froze. Gwen stood, blinking, confused. "Don't speak to her," Holmes said urgently. "Come to me, Gwen, now." The girl obeyed, slowly, stepping into the light. The woman remained. Then, without a word, she turned and fled back up the stair. Holmes followed, but the upper landing was empty. The trapdoor above the bell swung gently as if recently opened. Beyond it, only the stars and the mist. She had vanished. The top of the bell tower was empty, as Holmes had feared. The trapdoor above swung slowly on its iron hinges, creaking softly with each breeze that whispered across the rooftops. Beyond it, only the stars blinked down in silence. He scanned the narrow platform, then climbed swiftly up to the hatch. I followed a step behind, heart hammering, more from the unnatural stillness than exertion. Holmes emerged into the open roofline. Wind tugged at his coat, no signs of movement, no rope, ladder or ledge that could provide safe descent. The roof dropped sharply on all sides, 30 feet to the courtyard stones below. "She's not here," I said unnecessarily, catching my breath. "She was," Holmes murmured. He bent beside the hatch. Dust coated the wooden planks, undisturbed save for 2 sets of recent prints, one child-sized and one adult. The second trail led to the roof's edge and ended. "No ladder," Holmes muttered, rising. "No scaffold, not even a drain pipe she could have scaled down." "She couldn't have jumped," I said. "No, and yet—" He pointed to the far end of the roof. "See that?" Atop the chimney stack stood a bird, black, slender, motionless. It stared at us, then with a flutter it lifted into the sky and vanished into the fog. Holmes turned away from the edge. "She was never meant to be caught," he said, "only seen." Back inside, we found Gwen sitting on a pew in the chapel, wrapped in Miss Trenchard's shawl, her knees tucked beneath her chin. She looked dazed, but unhurt. Her wide grey eyes flicked to us as we entered, though she said nothing. Holmes knelt before her. "Gwen," he said gently, "do you remember how you got up there?" She hesitated, then almost inaudibly said, "She called me." "Who?" "The lady with the gloves." "Did she hurt you?" "No," the girl whispered. "She just talked." Holmes paused. "What did she say?" Gwen's gaze drifted to the stained glass window. "She said Eloise wanted me to finish the story. She said the mirror was still open." Holmes stiffened. "And did you see the mirror again?" She nodded slowly. "It was in the bell room, but it didn't show me." "Did it show someone else?" "Yes," she whispered. "It showed Eloise, but her mouth moved backward." I felt a cold knot twist inside me. Holmes asked one final question. "Did the woman say her name?" Gwen frowned, thinking. "Only Drowse. Holmes stood sharply, his face hardening. That confirms it? Evelyn Drowse? I asked. She never left the school? Holmes said. Not entirely. Back in Miss Trenchard's office, Holmes instructed the headmistress to send for a physician and the child's parents. Gwen was unharmed, but exhausted. Holmes assured them she was safe now, though he remained vague about details. He left out the trapdoor, the bell, the mirror. Only I and Holmes knew how close the girl had come to vanishing, entirely. As the house quieted again, and the hour grew late, Holmes requested Miss Trenchard produce Evelyn Drowse's personnel file. It was sparse, no photograph, no references that held under scrutiny. Her address, listed as a lodging house in Clerkenwell, was all they had. The handwriting on her application was familiar, too familiar. Holmes held it beside the note found in the music box. "A perfect match," he said grimly. "Same looped strokes, same upward slant." "But why insert herself into the school at all?" I asked. "Surely there are easier ways to terrorize a child?" Holmes folded the documents and slipped them into his coat. "Because terror was not the goal, Watson. Understanding was. Evelyn Drowse wanted Gwen to believe. She needed the child to willingly listen, just as Eloise did." He leaned against the mantel, his gaze far away. "There is someone behind Drowse. I believe she is merely the instrument. And now that Gwen has returned, our adversary will either vanish or escalate." By morning, Holmes had us in a cab to Clerkenwell. The fog lingered over the Thames like a veil not yet lifted from a corpse. The streets were waking, newspapers slapped on stoops, coal carts rattling past us. Number 16, Pelham Lane, was a 4-story boarding house wedged between a baker's and a pawnshop. The paint peeled in strips from its windowsills. A faded sign near the door read, "Rooms, let by the month. Inquire within." The landlady was a hunched woman with a netted cap and suspicion in her eyes. Holmes produced his card. "We're seeking a former lodger, Evelyn Drowse," she sniffed. "Drowse? That odd one. Room 3B. Gone a fortnight now, never said goodbye. Left the place like a church pew. Clean, neat, but cold." "May we look?" Holmes asked. The woman frowned, then nodded. "If she's done something wrong, I'll tell you. She gave me the willies, always muttering, always sketching." "Sketching?" I asked. The landlady handed Holmes a thin portfolio she'd found while cleaning the room. "Left this behind." Room 3B was small and plain. One window, a desk, a single bed. But what caught our attention immediately were the mirrors. 3 of them, each propped against a different wall. All old, mismatched, and deliberately angled so that any figure standing in the center of the room would be surrounded. Holmes stood in the middle, regarding himself from all directions. "A ritual," he murmured. "A performance. Rehearsed." He turned to the portfolio. Inside were 10 pages of sketches, charcoal drawings, meticulous and disturbing. Children's faces, mostly. Some smiling, some screaming, but always drawn as if seen through glass, blurred, doubled, distorted. One showed the bell tower, another the cellar. The last sketch was of a child standing before a mirror. Her back was to the viewer, but her reflection faced outward. The girl's name was scrawled underneath. Gwendolen. "This is obsession," I said, unable to keep the disgust from my voice. "No," Holmes replied. "This is documentation. Miss Drowse believed she was bearing witness to something no one else could understand. She sought to recreate it, to offer it up as truth." He tapped the mirror's frame. "And yet she remained hidden. Even now she disappears at will." I looked around the room, unnerved. Where did she go? Holmes lifted the last sketch again. "She will reappear," he said, "once she finds another child who listens." The mirror in room 3B seemed almost to breathe. Its warped surface held no movement, and yet the longer I stared into it, the more I felt an uneasy pressure, like standing on the edge of a stage moments before the curtain is drawn. Holmes had said Evelyn Drowse was rehearsing. But for what? He circled the perimeter of the room with quiet deliberation, tracing the scuffed floorboards with his eyes, touching the corners of the desk, the window frame, the backs of the other 2 mirrors. 3 mirrors. A trinity, he muttered. A deliberate composition. He stepped back to the center of the room, turning slowly on the spot. Watson, imagine for a moment you are a child standing here. 3 mirrors, all showing you from different angles. But one of them, only one, moves differently. Slightly out of step. A second too slow. He faced the largest mirror and narrowed his eyes. You begin to believe something is behind the glass. I shivered. Then it becomes a doorway. Exactly, not physically, of course, but in the child's mind, crafted, coaxed, and reinforced by someone like Evelyn Drowse. They're not abducted, Watson. They're invited. That is what makes it so insidious. And the drawings? I asked. What role do they play? Holmes unrolled the portfolio again, flipping to the sketch of Gwendolen before the mirror. She's staging a mythology, he said. Each sketch is a page in a visual gospel of sorts. Children and mirrors, the handprint, the bell, the cellar. The drawings are props, evidence for those willing to believe. She draws them not to remember, but to convince. He held the sketch closer. And yet, what? He turned the page over. On the back, in light pencil, was a list. Names: Eloise Bracknell, Gwendolen Marsh, Agnes Willoughby, Harriet Dane, Miriam Flinch. I felt my stomach sink. Are those, other children? Holmes nodded. Only one we've confirmed. The others, we must discover. We returned to Baker Street that evening. The portfolio of sketches sealed in Holmes's satchel, the list copied into his notebook. The fog followed us like an old debt, curling along gutters and chimney tops as though it too were searching for Evelyn Drowse. Back at our lodgings, Holmes plunged into the public record archives with vigour. He pored over school registries, hospital logs, missing person notices. I helped where I could, fetching volumes. From shelves, transcribing addresses. By midnight, we had our answers. Agnes Willoughby, vanished 1892, aged 10, reported as a runaway, never found. Harriet Dane, committed to Chiswick Asylum in 1895 after claiming her mirror spoke. Miriam Flinch died of fever in 1894, but Holmes noted something odd. The obituary was penned by a woman named E. Drowse. At the time, she had been listed as a private companion. She embedded herself, Holmes said, his voice low. Evelyn Drowse has spent years positioning herself close to girls between 9 and 12, always quiet children, imaginative, sensitive. She studies them, and then she isolates them. But for what purpose? Holmes leaned back in his chair. To create a narrative, one she can control. It is the psychological equivalent of a haunting, Watson. If you shape a child's world tightly enough, limit their sights, their sounds, their comforts, eventually they believe you are the only voice they can trust, even if you come from the mirror. I sat in silence for a moment, letting it settle. Do you believe she meant to harm them? He didn't answer for a moment. I believe, he said at last, that she believes she is protecting them, but from what? I do not yet know. The following morning brought an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Harriet Dane, now a woman of about 27, had seen our inquiry posted discreetly through medical channels and responded. She sat in our study, tightly gloved and pale, her posture rigid with a kind of worn restraint. Her gaze never quite settled. Miss Dane, Holmes said kindly, thank you for coming. May I ask, do you remember Evelyn Drowse? Her fingers twitched. I do. She came to us when I was 9. After my mother passed, my father hired her as a governess. Did she ever speak of mirrors? Harriet gave a small, bitter laugh. She lived in them. She would stand in front of my bedroom glass for hours, and then she told me... She hesitated. You may speak freely, Holmes said. She told me my mother was behind the glass, she whispered, waiting for me, that if I stood still long enough I could hear her breathe. I felt my breath catch. She said that only I could see her, that the others wouldn't understand. Holmes nodded slowly. Did she ever bring you to a bell tower? Or a schoolhouse? No. But she asked me to draw what I saw in the mirror. She said it helped bring it closer. And did you draw? Yes, she said, and her voice broke. And then I couldn't stop. She covered her mouth. My father found me one morning in front of the glass with a kitchen knife, saying I had to cut the reflection out before it got inside. Silence filled the room like smoke. Holmes rose and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. You are not to blame, Miss Dane. You were preyed upon. She manipulated you. I never saw her again, Harriet said. They told me she'd gone, but I still feel her sometimes, when the lights are low. Holmes met my eyes. Thank you for coming, he said. When she had gone, he turned to me. She follows a pattern, not of cruelty, but of control. She selects children at crossroads, those mourning, doubting, or isolated. Then she gives them structure through fear. I rubbed my temples. But to what end? She doesn't keep them, doesn't harm them directly. Gwen was returned. Eloise vanished. The others, some dead, some scarred. Holmes folded his hands before him. She's constructing a legacy, a folklore centered on mirrors and handprints and hidden compartments, and she's waiting for someone, perhaps herself, to step fully through. I stared at him. You think she believes she can cross into this fantasy she's built? Holmes nodded. And if not her, then the right child. He rose abruptly. Come, Watson, there is one place left we have not returned to. We took a cab back to Chelsea. The schoolyard was quiet, its winter garden still. Miss Trenchard met us at the rear gate, eyes wide. You're back. We need access to room 11. And to the cellar, Holmes said. And the mirror? Yes. It must be moved. She hesitated, then nodded. I'll fetch Mr. Pruitt. 20 minutes later, we stood in the cellar once more. The mirror, heavy, awkward, had been brought down on Holmes's orders and propped upright against the far wall. Holmes faced it, chin lifted slightly. She made the mirror a stage, a gate. But what if it also hides something else? He tapped the glass. The sound was dull. Then he turned to the back, removed the rear panel carefully. Behind the mirror's frame was a rolled sheet of vellum. Holmes unrolled it carefully. On it was a drawing, crude, childlike. It showed a hand open. In its palm, the words, "Let me in." And underneath, in the faintest ink, Gwen already did. The vellum crackled as Holmes held it to the light, his eyes narrowing on the simple image inked into its center. A single open hand, fingers splayed as if reaching outward. Inside the palm, written in a child's hesitant scrawl, were the words, "Let me in." And beneath them, smaller still, as if added in secrecy or doubt, Gwen already did. I felt a chill crawl between my shoulders, deeper than the cellar's damp could explain. It's her handwriting, Holmes said, voice low. Compare the loops of the G. They match Gwen's classwork in Miss Trenchard's file. But the final line, it's tremulous, irregular, written in fear, or perhaps not written willingly at all. He rolled the vellum gently and slipped it into his satchel before turning back to the mirror itself. For a moment, Neither of us spoke. We simply stood and stared into that ancient pane of glass, its surface blurred at the edges not by dirt, but by age, as though time had pressed fingerprints into it. Then Holmes spoke again, softly, without looking away. "There's something peculiar about this mirror, Watson." I arched an eyebrow. "Besides the fact that it's being used as a prop in a child abduction ritual?" He almost smiled. "No, peculiar in its make. Look, do you see the brass joinery along the base?" I crouched beside him. "Yes, what of it?" "It's not original," Holmes said. "This mirror has been modified, reframed, likely purchased second-hand, perhaps from a theatre or an old estate. Mirrors of this size and curvature were often used in stagecraft, to produce illusions, doubled reflections, optical tricks. And Evelyn Drowse used it," I said, slowly, "to construct something more than an illusion." Holmes stood and stepped back. "She built a myth, Watson. She gave it a set, a script, and an audience, a generation of girls with shadows on their hearts. We brought the mirror back to room 11 and sealed it in a heavy cloth. Miss Trenchard, visibly shaken, promised to have it removed entirely the following day. Holmes left her with strict instructions. Gwen Marsh was not to be told about the note found inside. Not yet. "Not until we're certain," he said. She asked, "Certain of what?" Holmes did not answer. Back at Baker Street, he spent hours reviewing the sketches again, laying them across the carpet like puzzle pieces. Gwen's drawing, the bell tower, the cellar, the mirror. A sequence emerged, always the same elements, reshuffled, recontextualized. The players changed, but the play remained the same. "She rehearses," Holmes said aloud, as if to himself. "But rehearses what?" I leaned forward in my chair. "If she's building a mythology," I offered, "then perhaps she sees herself not just as the conductor, but as the high priestess? The final act?" Holmes glanced at me with something like admiration. "Yes, Watson, that is precisely it. She casts herself as the guide through the veil, the one who teaches the child to see the unseen, to hear the bell, to step through the mirror." "But to where?" I asked. "None of the children vanished for good except Eloise. And even she left clues, drawings, a key." Holmes nodded slowly. "Which suggests she resisted. Broke the pattern. That may be why she was punished." "Punished?" "Drowse is not cruel by nature, but she is dogmatic. In her eyes, resistance must be corrected. Gwen's return may be part of that. The ritual was interrupted, and now Drowse must begin again." He rose abruptly and crossed to the bureau, withdrawing an envelope from a locked drawer. Inside was the letter found at the school. "She comes when they forget. I help them remember. She believes memory is the key. That forgetting, denying, rejecting the mirror severs the child from her world. So she brings them back to it again and again until they accept it fully. And then? Then she lets go," Holmes said darkly, "and the child crosses through." The next morning brought grim news. Miss Trenchard had sent a telegram. "Urgent. Gwen has begun drawing again. Same symbols. Refuses to speak. Said only she's waiting." Holmes read it aloud and said nothing for a long moment. Then he rose and reached for his coat. "Come, Watson, we return to Chelsea. If Gwen is relapsing, then Drowse has not vanished. She is circling." When we arrived at the school, Gwen was sitting in the infirmary, staring blankly at a drawing on her lap. Miss Trenchard met us at the door with tight lips and tired eyes. "She hasn't spoken since breakfast," she whispered, "except to say that one thing. The drawing, she won't let go of it." Holmes knelt beside the girl, careful not to crowd her. "Gwen," he said softly, "may I see what you've drawn?" She looked up at him, blinking once. Then slowly, she lifted the paper. The image was crude but unmistakable. A doorway, arched, flanked by 2 mirrors. Inside the arch, a shape. A woman, faceless, with gloved hands reaching forward. Above the drawing, written in dark pencil, was a single word. "Soon." Holmes stared at it, then took the girl's hand. "Gwen, listen to me. You don't have to go through the mirror. You're not alone." She looked up at him, and for the first time her lips trembled. "But she said I was." Holmes' voice dropped to a murmur. "She lies. That's how she keeps her place in the mirror." Gwen blinked again. "But I hear her, even when I close my eyes." Holmes glanced up at Miss Trenchard. "Where is the mirror now?" "In the storage annex," she said. "Pruitt helped me move it first thing this morning." "Show me," Holmes said. The storage annex was a narrow room at the far edge of the school's lower wing, unused since renovations 2 winters past. The mirror, draped in its black cloth, stood propped against the back wall beside unused desks and battered chairs. Holmes approached it like one might approach a sleeping animal. "I want no one else to enter this room today," he said quietly to Miss Trenchard. She nodded. I watched as Holmes lifted the cloth halfway. The mirror's surface shimmered with dust, but something had changed, something subtle. In the bottom left corner, barely visible, was a smudge, not a handprint, a fingerprint. Holmes studied it. Then, with his gloved hand, he pressed his own index finger against the glass beside it. Same size, same angle. "She was here," he murmured, "today." He let the cloth fall back over the glass. "We've no more time." That evening, Holmes returned to Baker Street with a bundle of papers, a vial of black ink, and a mirror he borrowed from the storage annex, one of the school's discarded hallway pieces. He set the mirror on the mantel, lit a single lamp, and instructed me not to speak until he was finished. For nearly an hour, he painted, carefully, symbols drawn in concentric circles, mirrored letters, arcane loops that looked part mathematical, part musical. I recognized some from Gwen's drawings, others from Drowse's sketches. Finally, he set the brush down and stepped back. "I'm going to invite her," he said. "To what?" I asked, breathless. "To speak." He turned to me, eyes cold and steady. "And when she does, Watson, you must not look in the mirror." The mirror Holmes had brought back from the school sat propped upon the fireplace mantel like some arcane relic. The gas lamp at his desk was the only light in the room, its flickering flame casting long shadows across the symbols, now inked around the mirror's frame. They shimmered faintly in the low light, curved lines and mirrored sigils forming a ring of meaning that to my eye held only the illusion of logic. Holmes sat cross-legged before it, as still as stone, his hands resting gently on his knees. I remained at the writing desk behind him, unsure whether to observe or intervene. He had said not to speak, and more importantly, not to look directly into the glass. The fire crackled low in the grate. The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual. I shifted in my seat. Holmes took a breath. "She comes to those who see," he said softly, his voice barely audible. "But she stays for those who listen. Evelyn, or whatever you call yourself now. If your game is memory, then let's remember." The mirror gave no reply. He continued. "You taught Eloise, you taught Gwen. But I've read your script now. I know your roles, the bell, the hand, the mirror, and the child who opens the door." Silence. Then, faintly, something changed. The temperature dropped. Not a gust, not a draft. A subtle coldness, like standing in a room just after someone has left it. The flame in the gas lamp flickered, once, then again. Holmes leaned forward, his reflection sharp in the glass. "You wanted to be believed," he whispered. "Then speak." And from behind the mirror, not from the room, came the first sound, not words, a low creak like a door slowly opening. I froze. Holmes didn't move. The sound deepened. Layers now, a hum beneath the creak, like wind over a broken bottle. Then something else, a voice, not loud, not angry, but unbearably intimate. "You see me now?" The words were spoken not aloud, but as if directly into the mind, a vibration behind the eardrum. Holmes closed his eyes. "I see you," he said. "But I am not your child." "You are the last." "No, I am the observer." "You brought her back." Holmes opened his eyes. "Gwen was never yours. None of them were. You fashioned your story out of grief and absence. You made yourself the ghost you feared." There was a pause. Then the voice returned, quieter now. "They came to me. They followed." "You taught them to?" "You built the path and called it destiny." The symbols around the mirror shimmered faintly, these ink reflecting the lamplight in subtle pulses. Then came the whisper, not in English. A string of sounds, mirrored and broken, like syllables read backwards. Holmes flinched, just slightly. I gripped the edge of my chair. "Stop," he said firmly. "You've no power here." The temperature dropped again. A soft tapping echoed from inside the mirror, 5 distinct knocks evenly spaced. Then silence. Holmes stood. He covered the mirror with a cloth. The room returned to itself, the ticking clock, the glow of the fire. But the chill remained. He poured himself a glass of water with hands that barely trembled. "What was that?" I asked, finally, my voice hushed despite myself. He did not answer right away. He set the glass down, removed his gloves, and stared at the covered mirror. "A performance," he said at last. "Scripted, meant to evoke fear or awe." "You believe it was drowse?" "Part of her," he replied. "What remains? She has fractured herself into symbols and rituals, mirrors, bells, handprints. They are the pieces of her identity. Each time she finds a child to believe in them, she becomes real again. Briefly." I stood and crossed the room. But the voice, it wasn't like hers. "No," Holmes said, "because it wasn't hers anymore. She's become something else. Not supernatural, but not entirely sane either. She's the echo of a woman who wanted to be seen and was forgotten." He returned to his desk and unrolled the note found in the mirror's hollow frame. "Let me in. Gwen already did. She needs the child to accept the story, that's the door. But once Gwen saw through it, truly, drowse lost her hold." I paced. "But if she still lingers, if she can return through mirrors, how do we stop her?" Holmes looked at me with that rare, quiet intensity he reserved for moments of true gravity. We removed the audience. The next day, Holmes returned to Chelsea with a letter drafted to the school's Board of Trustees. In it, he detailed a psychological contamination found in room 11, language vague enough to avoid scandal, yet strong enough to warrant the room's closure. He recommended the mirror be destroyed, the cellar sealed, and the bell rope replaced with a fixed clapper to prevent further tampering. The trustees, already shaken by the recent events, agreed. Within a week, the mirror was shattered and carted away, the cellar was bolted, the bell made silent. And Gwen Marsh, she stopped drawing. A month passed, winter set in. Holmes resumed other cases, bank fraud in Surrey, a jewel theft in Knightsbridge. But I noticed the way he moved now, slower, more reflective. One evening, as we walked along the Thames, he paused near the embankment where Eloise Bracknell had been found a year before. "I still wonder," he said, staring at the water. "Did she fall? Or was she let go?" "You mean murdered?" He shook his head. "No, released. Set free from the story Evelyn built, Eloise was the only one who didn't give in. She resisted, she saw the stage and refused to perform. He sighed. In that she showed more courage than most adults I know. That night, as I prepared for bed, Holmes sat by the fire with his violin. He played no tune, just a low, quiet series of notes, more mournful than melodic. I glanced at the covered mirror still resting against the mantel. "You're going to destroy it, aren't you?" He nodded. "Tomorrow." I turned away, but his voice stopped me. "Watson," he said softly, "if one day you see a reflection that moves before you do, don't follow it." I smiled. "I'd sooner follow your violin across rooftops, Holmes." But I knew he wasn't joking. The morning after Holmes declared his intent to destroy the mirror, Baker Street awoke beneath a pale sun, the first in weeks. The fog had lifted, not dispersed, but simply retreated, leaving behind a frost-dusted calm that felt too neat, too deliberate. I rose to find Holmes already dressed, standing by the hearth with a sledgehammer in one hand and the mirror in the other, still veiled in the thick canvas drape. He looked at me without ceremony. "Watson," he said, "come with me. I won't do this alone." I nodded, pulling on my coat. "Where?" "Somewhere no one will look." We hired a cart and travelled west out of the city, toward the edge of Hampstead Heath, where Holmes claimed there was an abandoned hunting lodge he'd once used for experiments requiring isolation. The road was empty, the trees bare and skeletal. The mirror, strapped and silent in the cart's rear, looked almost like a coffin. No words passed between us during the ride. Only when we reached the lodge, little more than a stone ruin, half swallowed by ivy and silence, did Holmes speak again. "I want to be sure," he said. He unloaded the mirror and stood it upright in the centre of the overgrown clearing. The canvas was peeled back. Even in the pale daylight, the glass gleamed. Holmes stepped forward and for the briefest moment stared at his reflection. Then he turned to me. "Do you believe she's gone?" I hesitated. "I believe Gwen has recovered, that the children are safe now, that whatever Evelyn Drowse once was, her influence is broken." "But not her idea," Holmes murmured. "That remains. The symbols, the stories, the mirror." He looked down at the hammer in his hand. "I wonder sometimes, Watson, whether the stories we tell, ghosts, shadows, whispers, grow legs when we stop fearing them, or if it's when we begin naming them that they gain their power." He lifted the hammer. The first blow struck with a crack like a gunshot. The mirror's frame splintered, but the glass held. Holmes struck again. On the third blow, the mirror screamed, or so I thought. A sharp, reverberating pitch rang out, not metallic, not glass shattering, but something like air being torn. I staggered back. Holmes didn't flinch. The mirror split vertically, the crack bisecting his reflection like a blade. Then the glass buckled inward, as if caving from unseen pressure. Finally, with a groan of wood and a burst of dust, the entire frame collapsed into itself. Silence returned. Only shards remained, some curved, some jagged, none large enough to hold an image. Holmes crouched and sifted through the debris. He lifted one sliver and studied it. "No light," he said. "What do you mean?" He turned the shard toward me. "Even broken, a mirror reflects. But this," he twisted it, "shows nothing." I took it. The surface was dull, not like cracked glass, like ash. We buried the fragments in the soil deep beneath the tree roots. When we left the grove, Holmes placed a flat stone atop the site and marked it with the heel of his boot. A simple X. He said nothing more. Back at Baker Street that evening, I found Holmes seated in his armchair with a thin envelope in hand. "A letter?" he said. "From Gwen." I raised my eyebrows. She wrote to thank us, said she's returned to her lessons. No drawings, no dreams, no more voices. He folded the letter carefully. She enclosed a sketch. He handed it to me. It was a simple drawing, crayon on school paper, a sun, a field, and a girl with a bonnet holding the hand of another figure. The second figure was taller, faceless. "She calls it Me and the Lady in the Light," Holmes said. I stared at it for a long while. "It's her way of reclaiming the story," I said at last, "turning the fear into something warm." Holmes nodded. "Children do that better than we do." He rose and crossed to the hearth, placing the sketch upon the mantel where the mirror once stood. "It belongs here," he said. For the next several days Holmes resumed ordinary life. He answered telegrams, resumed consultations, even visited the Diogenes Club. But there was a distance in him now, like a man who had seen something not meant to be seen. One night over supper he said quietly, "There are many cases I've solved, Watson. Crimes with motive, cause and consequence. But this was not crime. It was belief turned inward, madness perhaps, or grief transmuted into myth." He sipped his tea, then added, "And yet not a single law was broken until Eloise disappeared." "You think Drowse is still alive?" I asked. "I think she was never entirely whole to begin with. She may yet exist, as a person, or as a fragment. But what matters is that her stage has been dismantled." He gestured toward the hearth, "and that her audience has turned away." Winter passed into spring. I returned to my practice. Holmes took on cases again. We never spoke of the mirror aloud, not in public, not even in passing. But one morning in late March, as Holmes and I sat in silence reading, the post arrived, a plain envelope, no return address, no stamp. Inside only a page torn from a child's sketchbook, a single line drawn in charcoal, a handprint, pressed flat, smudged, and underneath, in familiar script, "I remember." Holmes turned it over, blank. Then after a long moment he said, "Watson, cancel your appointments. We may have one more act to attend." The envelope lay open upon Holmes's desk, its contents heavy with implication, though they weighed almost nothing at all. The charcoal handprint was not child-sized, nor was it perfectly shaped. One of the fingers dragged slightly, as if the pressure had faltered midway through the press. The smudging wasn't accidental. It suggested movement, an unfinished gesture, a repetition. Holmes stared at it for a long moment, fingertips pressed beneath his chin. "Is it Gwen?" I asked, my voice hushed despite the daylight streaming in from the window. "No," Holmes replied. "The proportions are wrong, larger, older, but not an adult's either." He turned the paper slightly toward the window light, as if shadows might unlock something the ink could not. "This was made by someone between the ages of 14 and 17, and not recently. The charcoal is faint. The smudge has already dried and lifted slightly from the page. This was drawn perhaps 2 or 3 weeks ago." "Then why send it now?" Holmes tapped the edge of the page. "Because they wanted it found now, because the moment, like a scene in a play, must be properly timed. We destroyed the mirror, broke the altar, burned the script, but the idea of the performance remains." He looked up at me sharply. "Which means we missed one." "One what?" "An audience member." Within the hour we were in a cab heading back to Chelsea. Holmes had written ahead to Miss Trenchard with a request that all class rosters from the previous 2 years be ready for our arrival, along with records of pupils who had transferred, withdrawn, or been placed under special supervision. She met us at the rear gate, coat pulled tightly against the March wind. "I thought this was finished," she said, though her eyes said otherwise. "So did we," Holmes replied. "But something lingers. We believe another child, an older one, was caught in Drowse's pattern." Someone who listened but never acted. A witness, perhaps, or a would-be participant. Miss Trenchard ushered us into her office. A stack of ledgers, folders, and slips of attendance paper awaited on the desk. Holmes sat immediately, fingers dancing over the documents with surprising gentleness. She would be a girl, he said, almost to himself. Reserved, quiet, perhaps prone to solitary habits, not disruptive, but not easily seen, the kind who could watch a younger girl descend into a world of mirrors and bells and say nothing. He turned a page, paused. Here. He held up a file. Clara Millen, age 15. Transferred from a grammar school in Hounslow the previous winter. Attended regularly. Good marks, no infractions. But then, withdrawn, I read aloud, on February 9th. The day after Gwen was found, Holmes noted. Miss Trenchard's brows drew together. I remember her now, soft-spoken. She always sat near Gwen, helped her with art lessons. Was she ever close with Evelyn Drowse? The headmistress hesitated. She followed her. I recall one day I passed the drawing-room and Clara was sitting on the floor with Drowse beside her, both sketching. It didn't seem improper, but I remember thinking it looked more like mimicry than companionship. Where is she now? Miss Trenchard searched a drawer and produced an envelope. She left no forwarding address, but the withdrawal paperwork lists her guardian's home. Her uncle, a Mr. Edwin Carow, in Shoreditch. Holmes slipped the address into his notebook. Watson, we've an appointment. Shoreditch at dusk was a symphony of motion and noise. Costermongers shouted the last of their wares, lamplighters worked their way along the alleys, and the clatter of hooves mingled with the creak of woodcarts and the bark of mongrels. We arrived at number 12 Harrow Lane, just as the sun dipped below the rooftops. Mr. Edwin Carow proved to be a lank, narrow man with thinning hair and a nervous blink. When Holmes introduced us and asked after Clara Millen, the man's expression darkened. She's not here, he said quickly. But she was, Holmes said. Carow hesitated, then sighed. She came to me after leaving school, said she was tired of classrooms. I tried to send her back, but she wouldn't go. She spent most of her time drawing, always in the back parlour. She said she was rehearsing something. Holmes and I exchanged glances. Where is she now? Holmes asked. Carow shifted uncomfortably. She left 5 days ago, took nothing but a satchel, said she had somewhere to be, that she was ready. Holmes's voice sharpened. Did she say where? Only this. I'm going to see the curtain fall. I assumed it was metaphor. Holmes stood abruptly. It's not. We returned to Baker Street just after nightfall. Holmes, unusually silent, moved immediately to the files he kept in his personal archive. Those reserved for cases that never went to trial, for mysteries without firm endings. He pulled one from the shelf, the Eloise Bracknell case. From within it, he withdrew a photograph I had never seen. It was grainy but clear enough. A school performance in the Chelsea Day School drawing room. Children in paper crowns, painted props. An audience of parents blurred in the background. Holmes pointed to the front row. Eloise Bracknell, seated stage left. I nodded. Then he pointed to the far right. Clara Millen. 2 years younger, she would have been 13. I leaned closer. She was there the night of the final rehearsal. Holmes nodded grimly. She watched it all. The drawings, the mirror, Gwen's descent, but she never entered the story. Not then. And now? Now she means to finish it. We scoured the city over the next 48 hours. Holmes placed discreet notices through educational channels, cab firms, even the stage managers of local theatre houses. Finally a lead, a stagehand at the decaying Alderney Street Theatre, a venue long since condemned and scheduled for demolition, reported that a girl had been seen slipping inside through a broken service door 2 nights ago. "She carried a satchel," the man said, "and was muttering something about a queue." We arrived at Alderney Street Theatre just past 10. The moon hung high and pale, casting fractured light through the broken rafters and shattered windows. Holmes entered first. The theatre had been gutted, its seats removed, curtains rotted, stage boards warped by water and time. But there, centre stage, stood a girl. Clara Millen. She was barefoot, her school skirt threadbare, her blouse painted with charcoal handprints. Behind her, a sheet of cracked glass hung from a wooden frame, rough, makeshift, unmistakably meant to be a mirror. She looked up as we entered. "Too late," she said calmly. Holmes raised a hand. "Clara, you don't have to do this." She smiled faintly. "But I already have." She stepped aside. The mirror behind her showed no reflection, only depth, as if the glass had given way to mist. Holmes stepped forward. "You are not Evelyn Drowse." Clara tilted her head. "No, but I listened longer than anyone, and now she listens back." She turned to the mirror and took a step forward. For the briefest moment, Clara Millen's feet touched the rim of the broken stage, and the cracked mirror behind her shimmered, not with light, but with suggestion. The surface did not reflect her. It absorbed her outline. She stood between absence and presence, her hand halfway lifted, as though caught in the act of knocking upon nothing. Holmes didn't raise his voice. "Clara," he said, quiet and firm, "step away. There is no door. There never was." She turned her head slightly, one eye visible in the shadow cast by the swaying rafters above. "She said I was next," Clara murmured. "She's been waiting. Gwen wasn't ready. Eloise was too early, but I know all the lines. I've studied the cues." She stepped forward again. A floorboard groaned beneath her foot. "Clara," I said, taking a cautious step toward the stage, "you've rehearsed a fiction. Drowse created a story for you, but that's all it is, a fabrication. She's not behind that glass. She's in you, and you can let her go." She didn't flinch. Holmes moved closer, eyes locked on hers. She wanted to be remembered, Clara. That's why she chose girls who were overlooked, who wouldn't be missed if they slipped into shadows. She made herself a myth so she could remain with you. "She saved me," Clara whispered. "She was the only one who saw me." "No," Holmes said, firmly. "She used you, your silence, your longing. She needed you not to speak, and now you're standing on the edge of her lie." The wind outside shifted. A pane of glass above us groaned in its frame. The curtain, or what remained of it, trembled. Clara's gaze broke, just slightly. Her eyes darted downward. "She told me the door would open," she whispered. "If I gave everything, if I believed hard enough." Holmes took another step forward. He was on the stage now, moving slowly, deliberately, like a man entering a sanctum. "And now you must decide, Clara, not whether you believe in her, but whether you believe in yourself. She's gone. Her script is broken. You're the last page." For a long moment, she didn't move. Then, with a sound like a breath breaking free from glass, she lowered her hand. The mirror, if that's what it was, did not shatter. It simply dulled. Its faint shimmer collapsed inward. What remained was only a warped pane, scratched and dusted with soot. A prop, no more enchanted than the broken chairs or torn velvet drapes around it. Clara's knees buckled. Holmes caught her just before she fell. We brought her back to Baker Street under the veil of night. She slept for hours, deeply, peacefully. When she awoke, she didn't ask for Evelyn Drowse. She asked for tea. Holmes obliged, placing the cup into her hands as she sat wrapped in a blanket by the fire. "She's quiet now," Clara said softly. I don't hear her anymore. She was never real, Holmes replied. Not in the way you imagined. She was fear-given voice, a structure built around loneliness. Clara looked up. Then why did she feel so strong? Because myth is stronger than logic, he said, until it's faced. She said nothing more after that. When her uncle came to collect her later that evening, she embraced him without hesitation. As they left, Clara paused in the doorway. She wanted to be remembered, she said. Does that mean I'll always carry her? Holmes shook his head. It means you'll remember yourself. That's the only part that matters. In the days that followed, Holmes tied off the final threads with meticulous care. He met privately with Miss Trenchard, delivering his conclusion in reserved but pointed language. There will be no further incidents, he told her. But I suggest you remove any surviving mirrors from the school, especially those in classrooms. If the myth survives anywhere, it will do so in silence and glass. She agreed. Gwen Marsh, for her part, recovered fully. Her parents sent word a week later she had resumed drawing, but now filled her sketchbooks with gardens, constellations, and portraits of her family. Not one contained a handprint. The case of the Schoolhouse handprint never reached the papers. Holmes refused even to document it in full, though he permitted me to retain my notes. Let it die quietly, he said. Fiction craves retelling. But truth only needs remembering once. One evening, some weeks later, Holmes and I sat by the fire. He was in his chair, violin in hand, though he had yet to play a note. I was rereading the last page of Clara's school record, which Miss Trenchard had discreetly sent to us for our files. It had been updated by hand. Status re-enrolled. Remarks. Displays improved confidence. No further disturbances. I smiled. Holmes saw the expression and nodded slightly. She closed the curtain, he said. Who? Clara. She was the understudy, Drowsy's final hope, but she walked off stage. He placed the violin aside. It ends here, Watson. I believed him until the next morning. A single envelope waited on the mantel. Unmarked, no postmark. Inside was a sketch. 3 girls holding hands, one with her eyes closed, one with her mouth stitched, one with a mirror where her face should be. Holmes stared at it for a long while, then he placed it into the fire. The edges curled, the ink blistered, and then gone.